about the deck shirtless and sweating. But Odysseus couldn't enjoy any of the grand weather, nor did he suspect his crew was, as they gathered before him in an orderly sort of cluster, about as orderly as they got, anyway. "It seems like we have two choices," Eurylochus was saying, as he slurped the wine and pointed over to the right, where a sheer chalk-white cliff towered over the ship. There was a scar-shaped crack in the cliff wall, and out from that crack spilled what Eurylochus had called Scylla. And by the gods, was it a beast! It had to have been at least twice the size of his ship, with 6 serpent-like heads that were moving as erratically as the waves, never still. From this distance, which wasn't necessarily far at all, it looked as if every head was hysterically laughing at them, bobbing left and right as its razor-sharp teeth snapped open and closed. In amongst those 6 heads, however, was the haggard, misshapen head of a giant woman who looked dazed for the most part, eyes rolling back, languidly moving left and right. But that wasn't even the worst of it. Its body was a misshapen thing, all a sickly green colour with the sagging, wrinkling skin of an old woman. "We either sail past dear Scylla over there," Eurylochus said, "or we sail past Charybdis over there on the left." Charybdis wasn't much of a looker either, but at least it looked natural, conceived by nature herself. Odysseus hadn't considered it a monster at all, but Eurylochus had gone about naming it, and since then it had stuck. To Odysseus, it was a gigantic whirlpool in the near distance, sucking in the waves and anything else that was within its reach. Odysseus had to keep touching the helm, pulling the ship on course, as it was gently tugged towards the water beast. Odysseus breathed in deep that salty, fresh air, and found himself coughing it all out. The crew's combined stench met him instead, an invisible cloud of unwashed flesh, sweat, dirty rags, and God knows what else. If they survived this, he'd have them all thrown in the sea with soap and wouldn't let them back on until they were a sight more dignified. You wouldn't catch him sweating and prancing about the ship, half naked and stinking. Even now, in the heat, he stood in his captain's uniform, with barely a drop of sweat on his brow. But he'd save the discipline of the men for the ones that survived. There was no use parting wisdom on dead men now, was there? He glanced at Scylla, and the 6 heads were still glued to him, their green eyes burning with an impatient rage. The old woman's head that sat atop the beast may as well have been asleep at this point. There was barely a twitch on her wrinkled, rotten face. Then he glanced over to Charybdis and saw the violent splashing of water as it whirled around and around, never stopping. It was like trying to choose a way to die. "Are you sure I can't interest you in that wine, sir?" Eurylochus gave him a nudge. Odysseus didn't even look at him this time, as he hearkened at the crew. "We have a dilemma." The crew stood to attention at his voice, and the ones who were cowering at the edge of the ship at the sight of the 2 monsters refocused their attention on him. "As you can see, we have to pass through these narrow waters with Scylla on our right and—" He stopped to look at Eurylochus. "Charybdis," he supplied. Odysseus rolled his eyes. "Charybdis." "Which one is worse?" someone called out from the deck below. "Scylla will no doubt tear our ship to pieces," Odysseus announced, before considering the giant whirlpool. "Charybdis will, well, it will also tear our ship to pieces." The crew made a resounding moan. "But if we go through Scylla first," Odysseus stroked his chin in thought, "we might be able to sail through, unlike Charybdis, who will suck us in, hold us in its grip, and never let go." He didn't say much else. He watched as the crew considered both avenues, perhaps the most thoughtful he'd seen them since they'd repelled the sirens. A few lines of hardened faces glanced up at him with grizzled respect, nodding to him as if they weren't fussed about which decision he'd make, because they'd stick by it either way. The others were a bit more hesitant, some of them chewing their nails and shaking in their sandals, their steel swords rattling against the wood of the deck. "Shall I have the men raise the sails?" Eurylochus asked, as he pointed at Scylla. "Hold on." He lifted his hand. They couldn't go about sailing in the path of Scylla with a good chunk of them soiling them.